Welcome to A Guide to Every Deck in EDH, and this week we're looking at some of the new commanders from Outlaws of Thunder Junction. Today it's going to be the Gitrog Ravenous Ride. So unlike the previous Gitrog monster, this Gitrog is pretty different other than costing the same mana. So it is a 5 mana creature, it's a 6/5 with trample and haste, and it has saddle 1, which means you can tap a creature or any number of creatures with at least 1 power to saddle it, which is basically the same thing as crewing a vehicle. In this case, the Gitrog says, whenever the Gitrog Ravenous Ride deals combat damage to a player, you may sacrifice a creature that saddled it this turn. If you do, draw X cards, then put up to X land cards from your hand onto the battlefield tapped, where X is the sacrificed creature's power. So one note is that regardless of how many creatures you use to saddle the Gitrog, you can only sacrifice one of them. Secondly, you do have to connect with your opponent. It's not just an attack trigger, although 6 power of trample and haste should get you there. And then finally, it doesn't just draw cards, it puts lands from your hand onto the battlefield, which means anything that involves sacking your lands is not as big of a deal as it normally would be. And obviously, like Selvala, this commander cares about high power creatures, so we're going to want as many cheap, incredibly high power creatures as possible that we can use to both crew, or saddle in this case, the Gitrog, and then sack to the Gitrog to draw a whole bunch of cards. So we've got our big power creatures. These are the best creatures that you're going to find, all for 4 mana and under, although preferably you'd like to pay less than 4. But basically, it's 4 mana and under so that you can at least go play this big creature, next turn play the Gitrog attack. So you don't want them to cost more, and obviously, just in general, you want them to be as cheap as possible. So there's Daemogoth Titan, which is a 4 mana 11/10. Whenever it attacks or blocks, sack a creature. That's perfectly fine because we never intend to attack or block with it. We just want it to allow us to draw 11 off of the Gitrog. There is Hunted Bone Brute, which has an ability that doesn't matter because all we care about is that it's a 3 mana 6 power creature. Hunted Horror gives our opponent 2 3/3 pro-black creatures when it enters, but again, that doesn't matter. So it does matter in the sense that those creatures can be used to block the Gitrog, but as long as, we've got 2 other opponents that we can attack, that shouldn't be a problem. Hunted Troll creates 4 1/1 fairy tokens with flying and is an 8 power creature. We've got Lupine Prototype as a 5/5 that can't attack or block unless the player has no cards in hand, although again, we don't care about that because we only care about saddling the Gitrog with it. Pugnacious Hammerskull, which is a 3 mana 6/6. Relic Golem, 3 mana 6/6. Can't attack or block unless an opponent has 8 or more cards in their graveyard. Again, we do not care about attacking or blocking with any of these things. We just want the highest power for the lowest cost to saddle the Gitrog. Shakedown Heavy, 3 mana 6/4. And Traxos, 4 mana 7/7. Now it enters tapped and doesn't untap. However, it untaps when you cast a historic spell, and the Gitrog, of course, is a historic spell, so that part of it doesn't matter either. Now again, you would never ever play any of these creatures on their own, but with the Gitrog, they become good. There are, of course, other creatures that we could have played in this slot. I felt like 9 was a sufficient amount of creatures, but you could play more. If you're looking for specifically big creatures that you might find to be viable, I would look at the Selvala deck for examples, but a lot of those creatures have the problem of they have vanishing, or they die, or have some means by which they're going to go away. There's other cards like the 7 power dinosaur that causes you to discard on your upkeep, which again I felt like was a bad exchange. We don't want to be discarding cards to this. So these are the creatures that don't really have drawbacks in the sense of they don't go away, they don't cause us to discard, they don't cause us to sacrifice creatures. So that was my thinking behind these specific creatures. You could also, like Selvala, use pump spells, but I've opted not to do that because that feels like having to put a lot of different things together, where Selvala is fine just pumping itself. Here you need an additional creature plus the pump spell, so I'd rather just go for only the creature and use that alone, and that be sufficient. Next up, we've got Spelunking, and we'll find other cards like Amulet of Vigor in this slot as well, which allow us to, because the Gitrog puts the lands into play, but it puts them into play tapped, we want to be able to untap and use them immediately, so cards like Spelunking, Amulet of Vigor, and Tiller Engine, which are going to come up later, are good in this case. And here they are, Amulet of Vigor and Tiller Engine, which is basically the same thing as Amulet of Vigor and Spelunking, just lands enter, you can untap them. Next is going to be some card draw. Now, we're going to have the typical stuff like Ring, Bolas' Citadel, Necropotence, Sylvan Library, but in this case, we're also playing a bunch of extremely high-powered creatures, so in the case that we can't get the Gitrog online, or maybe we can't attack with it for some reason, or for whatever reason, the Gitrog is not going to be viable, we have other ways of drawing cards based on power, so Greater Good, Life's Legacy, and Altar of the Wretched. This is by no means the full extent of cards that care about power and then draw you a bunch of cards, but these were the ones I considered to be the best. Also the Great Henge, if we're going to play a bunch of super high power creatures anyway, may as well run this. We've got our combo, which is basically the Wither Chain combo, Wither Bloom Apprentice plus Chain of Smog to win the game. We do need a way to win the game other than just hitting our opponent with the Gitrog monster. Again, if you are averse to combos, well, I'm not sure why you would really be playing this deck in the first place, but if you are averse to combos and you don't want to run this, you're just going to need to run some sort of big threat that can win the game on its own. We've got some fast mana because it doesn't really matter whether we go behind on mana, because once the Gitrog hits our opponent, we get to draw a bunch and put a bunch of lands into play, so we can afford to burn cards on fast mana. So we've got stuff like Jeweled Lotus, Lotus Petal, Spirit Guide, Ritual, Calling Ritual, Dark Cabal Ritual, Blood Pet. There are many more fast mana cards that you could have included here. I've got a whole package on fast mana cards if you want to take a look at that. Specifically in this deck, Squandered Resources, which allows you to sack a land, add to your mana pool 1 mana of any type the sacked land could produce. This is normally a card that's just played in like Glass Cannon combos, but because the Gitrog allows us to put a bunch of the drawn cards into play as lands, if we drew a bunch of lands off of it, this potentially can be good enough if we know that the Gitrog is going to be able to get through. Fairly typical mana base, with the only standouts here really being Dryad Arbor because we've got Green Sun Zenith to fetch it, but otherwise pretty stock mana. We've got some protection for the Gitrog because again, we don't want to go through all the trouble of playing the Gitrog only for it to get killed or countered, so Allosaurus Shepherd, Cavern of Souls, Delighted Halfling, Veil, Defense Grid to make sure it doesn't get countered, City of Solitude, Sylvan Safekeeper to make sure it doesn't die once it's in play, bunch of ramp, nothing really much to say about that. However, the one thing I would mention is that lands that, land ramp, so things like Farseek, Nature's Lore, 3 Visits are more valuable than normal because we have cards like Squandered Resources and Sylvan Safekeeper to sack our lands. Also, we do have a Selvala in here because we are incidentally playing a bunch of really high power creatures, so Selvala can potentially be just a really big way of ramping. A little bit of removal because we do need to actually be able to interact with our opponent, so Abrupt Decay, Trophy, Kenrith's Transformation, Rex Age, and Snuff Out. Some tutors, in particular things like Survival of the Fittest to go find the exact big creatures that we want. I've opted not to run any reanimation effects along with Survival, but you could if you wanted to. But yeah, that is pretty much going to be the Gitrog monster. So again, get a big creature into play, play the Gitrog, hopefully it doesn't get countered or killed, and you can use protection spells to make sure that that doesn't happen. Attack an opponent, hit them, sacrifice your big creature, draw a whole bunch of cards, put all your lands that you drew into play, and then if that doesn't allow you to win, hopefully at least you've gone sufficiently high enough in value to pull ahead of your opponents. Yep, that is going to be the Gitrog Ravenous Ride for EDH.